Before the first word of this story is spoken, there is one fact you should hold quietly in your mind. Every dollar, every pound, every euro you have ever touched, every note you have folded into a wallet, every number you have watched appear on a screen when you checked your balance, every transaction that has quietly moved through the invisible infrastructure of the modern world has been shaped by a system that was designed in secret, not by elected parliaments, not by the public deliberation of democracies, not by the slow, transparent machinery of government, by 7 men travelling under assumed names on a private rail car to an island off the coast of Georgia in November of 1910. They told the staff they were going duck hunting. They were not going duck hunting. What they built in 10 days, in the low-lit rooms of a private resort where the wealthy came to escape the world, would become the architecture of money itself, the hidden skeleton inside every economy on Earth. And almost no one, for decades afterward, would know it had ever happened. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is something quieter, and in some ways stranger than that. It is a story about how the systems that govern our daily lives are assembled, gradually, imperfectly, and often in the margins of history, by human beings operating under pressure, with interests of their own, doing the best they could with what they understood. Sometimes brilliantly, sometimes catastrophically. Settle in. The fire is low, the night is long, and this particular story begins not in Georgia and not in America, but in a counting house in medieval Florence, where a man with a wooden bench and a leather ledger first discovered that trust, pure, invisible, fragile trust, could be made to behave like money. You're sitting somewhere quiet now. Perhaps the light in the room is low. Perhaps the sounds of the day have softened into something distant and shapeless. The weight of the hours is beginning to settle, and there is nothing pressing at the edges of your attention, nothing that needs doing before morning. This is a good moment to think about money. Not money in the urgent sense, not the kind of thinking that tightens the chest or sharpens the jaw, but money in the deeper, stranger sense, the way it actually works, the machinery underneath the surface of ordinary life, the gears and counterweights and hidden chambers that most of us will never see, but that quietly determine the temperature of everything. Because the truth is that most people move through their entire lives without ever pausing to wonder where money actually comes from. Not the particular bills in their wallet, not that small question, but the larger one. Who decides how much money exists in the world? Who controls the rate at which it flows? Who determines the cost of borrowing it, the punishment for printing too much of it, the reward for holding it still? The answer, it turns out, is a small group of institutions called central banks. They're among the most powerful institutions in human history, more powerful, in practical terms, than most governments, capable of cooling an overheated economy with a single policy statement, capable of flooding a paralyzed one with liquidity before most people have finished their morning coffee. Their decisions shape employment levels, the price of houses, the cost of starting a business, the value of pensions, the fate of currencies, and yet most people could not describe, in even approximate terms, what they are, how they work, or how they came to exist. The story of how they came to exist is what we are here to tell tonight. It stretches across 3.5 centuries. It winds through the counting houses of Renaissance Florence, the gilded corridors of the English court, the overcrowded trading floors of Paris and Amsterdam, the panicked back rooms of New York banks in the grip of financial crisis, a drafty conference room in the mountains of New Hampshire during the final years of a world war, and a private island off the Georgia coast, where 7 men arrived carrying shotguns they never intended to use. There are no simple villains in this story. The men who built the central banking system were, in many cases, responding to genuine crises, solving real problems, preventing catastrophes that had already happened once and threatened to happen again. They were also, in many cases, protecting their own interests. Both things are true and neither cancels the other. What they built has fed billions of people and impoverished millions. It has funded wars and ended them. It has made the modern world possible, with all of its comforts and all of its inequalities. Let the room settle around you. Let the breath slow. We begin at the beginning. The word bank comes from a bench, not a metaphorical bench, not a poetic one, a literal wooden bench, banco in Italian, on which a money changer would sit in the marketplace of a medieval city and perform the slow, precise work of converting one currency into another, Florentine ducats into Venetian grossi, Spanish maravedis into Milanese ambrosini. The currencies of the medieval world were as varied and unstable as the political entities that minted them, and the man behind the bench, patient, meticulous, with a set of scales and a trained eye for the weight and purity of metal, was the essential lubricant of commerce. If he was found to be dealing dishonestly, the city's magistrates would come and break his bench. In Italian, bancarotta, the bankrupt table, the origin of a word that would in time acquire a great deal of human tragedy behind it. You can imagine the scene easily if you let yourself. A warm morning in Florence in, say, the year 1420. An open square ringed by the workshops of artisans, the stalls of cloth merchants, the offices of wool guild administrators. The air smells of horse and river water, and the warm stone that holds the night's cold a little past sunrise. The money changer's bench is set up near the colonnade, shaded but visible. People come and go with small cloth pouches, coins are weighed, notes are exchanged. The ledger fills with neat columns of figures in a hand so practiced it borders on the mechanical. But the money changer is only one ancestor of what would eventually become the central bank. The more direct ancestor was born about 40 miles north, in the city of Genoa, sometime in the 12th century, where merchants began solving a problem that had plagued traders for as long as there had been trade. The problem was simple and physical. Gold is heavy. If you were a Genoese merchant trading wool for spices across the full breadth of the Mediterranean world, you could not carry enough gold to fund your purchases. The roads were dangerous. Ships sank. Bandits existed in considerable professional confidence. Moving large quantities of physical metal across the known world was expensive, slow, and frequently lethal. The solution that emerged, gradually, imperfectly, through trial and error and the accumulated practice of thousands of individual transactions, was the bill of exchange, a letter, a piece of paper that said, in effect, "I promise that when you present this document to my agent in Barcelona, he will give you the equivalent in local currency of the sum you've given me here in Genoa today." It was not money. It was a promise that functioned like money, a claim on future payment, a piece of paper backed not by gold in a vault, but by the reputation and creditworthiness of the merchant who issued it. And here, in this small, elegant, almost invisible step, is the first appearance of the idea that would eventually reshape the entire world economy. The idea that a piece of paper could carry value, that trust, formalized in writing, could circulate through a commercial system and do the work that physical metal had always done, without the weight, without the danger, without the slow clinking inefficiency of coins. It would take centuries more for this idea to reach its full expression. But it began here, in the back offices of Genoese wool merchants, in the careful handwriting of men who were trying to solve a very practical problem and who had no idea what they were starting. The Florentine banking families, the Bardi and the Peruzzi in the 13th and 14th centuries, and the Medici in the 15th, took this basic innovation and extended it into something that began to resemble banking as we would recognize it. The Medici, under Cosimo de' Medici, operated a network of branch offices in Venice, Rome, Geneva, Bruges, and London, all connected by a system of correspondent accounts and letters of credit that allowed wealth to flow across Europe in ways that would have seemed almost magical to earlier generations. They also made an innovation that would prove crucial. They accepted deposits. Wealthy individuals who could not safely store gold in their own homes, and in 15th century Florence, keeping gold in your home was an invitation to specific and violent forms of social interaction, would entrust their money to the Medici. In return, the Medici would issue a receipt, a written promise to repay the sum on demand. But the Medici, of course, did not simply lock the gold in a chest and leave it there. They lent it out. They invested it. They kept only enough on hand to satisfy the typical daily demand for withdrawals, and they put the rest to work. If everyone who had deposited money with the Medici had come to demand it back at the same moment, the Medici would not have been able to pay them. This is not a dark secret about the Medici. It is a simple structural feature of banking that has existed since the practice began and that continues to define how banks operate today. Banks do not hold your money in a box with your name on it. They use it. They lend it. They are, fundamentally, in the business of taking short-term obligations, your ability to demand your deposit back at any time, and converting them into long-term assets, the loans they have extended to others. There is something extraordinary about this when you sit with it quietly. The entire banking system, the entire structure of modern finance, rests on the assumption that not everyone will want their money back at the same time. It is, in the most literal sense, a system built on trust, on the collective, mostly unconscious agreement of millions of people to believe in something that is, structurally speaking, a kind of managed fiction. The risk embedded in this structure, the possibility that too many depositors might want their money simultaneously, is called a bank run. It has been one of the recurring nightmares of financial civilization, appearing in every century since the Medici, in every country that has developed a banking system sophisticated enough to offer deposits. It appears in the London coffee houses of the 17th century. It appears in the Paris streets of 1720. It appears in the autumn of 1929, when long, quiet lines of ordinary people formed outside American banks, waiting to retrieve savings that were no longer there. The history of banking is in many ways a history of the recurring effort to prevent bank runs, or to contain them when they happen, or to build institutions capable of managing the chaos they produce. Somewhere in London in the 1640s, the goldsmith trade was undergoing a quiet transformation that would eventually answer part of that question. Goldsmiths, craftsmen who worked with precious metal and who had naturally robust safes and security arrangements, began to offer storage services to wealthy citizens. You could bring your gold coins to a goldsmith, and he would give you a receipt, a written note acknowledging that he held a certain quantity of gold in your name. The receipt itself was transferable. You could hand it to a merchant in payment for goods, and the merchant could take it to the goldsmith and claim the gold. The receipt had become, in practical terms, money. And then a goldsmith, whose name history has not thought to preserve, noticed something. The gold that people had deposited with him rarely moved. People came and went with receipts, but the gold itself sat in the vault, almost undisturbed. People trusted the receipts more than they wanted the metal, which meant that the goldsmith could, with some care, issue more receipts than he had gold to back them. He could lend those receipts, charge interest on them, and as long as not too many people asked for the actual gold at the same time, no one would ever know. This was fractional reserve banking in its simplest, most naked form, the creation of money through the act of lending, with only a fraction of actual metal held in reserve. It is the foundational mechanism of every commercial bank in the world today, and it raised, immediately and obviously, the question that would occupy governments and economists for the next 3 centuries. What happens when the fraction runs out? What happens when the trust breaks? What happens when everyone wants the gold at once, and there is not enough gold? The question hung in the air over those London goldsmith shops like smoke that never quite dispersed. And it was still hanging there, 50 years later, when a Scottish financier named William Paterson walked into the offices of King William III of England with a proposal so audacious and so precisely calibrated to the king's desperation that it would change the nature of money itself. But before Paterson, before the Bank of England, before the formal architecture of central banking came into existence, there were other experiments that pointed in the same direction. The Bank of Amsterdam, established in 1609, is perhaps the most important of these precursors. It was founded not to lend money, but to provide a stable, reliable medium for commercial exchange in a city that had become the trading hub of the known world. Amsterdam in the early 17th century was the centre of the spice trade, the grain trade, the cloth trade, the slave trade, and the trade in financial instruments that were themselves becoming a form of commerce. The city's merchants dealt with hundreds of different currencies from dozens of different political entities, each of varying purity and each subject to periodic debasement by the government that issued it. The Bank of Amsterdam solved this problem with elegant simplicity. It accepted coins of all kinds, assessed their metal content with precision, and issued receipts denominated in a standardized unit called bank money. The bank money was worth exactly the metal it represented, and never fluctuated against it. Merchants could pay each other in bank money, by book entry, by the transfer of accounts, without ever touching physical metal at all. The bank's accounts were the settlement mechanism for an enormous proportion of European commerce. Its reputation for reliability and impartiality made it, for over a century, the envy of every other financial centre in Europe. The Bank of Amsterdam did not lend. This was intentional and considered. Its founders believed that the integrity of the bank money depended on its full backing in metal, and that lending, creating obligations in excess of reserves, would compromise that integrity. For many decades, they were correct. The Bank of Amsterdam's stability was its product, and it maintained that stability by declining to manufacture credit. But the pressures of time and commerce were unrelenting. In the 1770s, as the Dutch East India Company, the Voges, began to struggle under the weight of colonial overreach and mismanagement, the Bank of Amsterdam quietly began to extend the company credit. It began, in other words, to do what it had always refused to do. The loans were not public. The departure from full reserve banking was concealed from the depositors, who trusted the bank's promise of full metallic backing. When the concealment was finally revealed, in 1792, the reaction was swift and irreversible. Confidence evaporated. The bank collapsed. Amsterdam's position as the centre of the world finance was fatally compromised, and the mantle passed to London, whose Bank of England had, with considerably less institutional elegance but considerably more practical flexibility, built the model that would endure. There is a lesson in this that is quiet but persistent. The institutions that try to escape the nature of banking entirely, that refuse the credit creation function in the name of absolute stability, tend to be overwhelmed eventually by the demands of the world they serve. And the institutions that embrace credit creation without adequate oversight tend to destroy themselves with equal inevitability. The history of banking is, in a certain sense, the history of finding the middle ground between these two failure modes. That middle ground is narrow. It shifts with circumstances, and finding it requires exactly the kind of institutional wisdom that, in 1792, the Bank of Amsterdam did not quite have, but that the Bank of England across the water was slowly, painfully, imperfectly developing. William III of England was, in the spring of 1694, a man with a very specific problem. He needed money. Not in the ordinary sense that kings had always needed money, not the chronic, low-grade financial discomfort of maintaining a court, funding ambassadors, and keeping the palace in an acceptable state of repair. He needed money in the acute, burning sense of a man who has been at war with the most powerful monarch in Europe for several years and is beginning to run out of the means to continue. The war was against Louis XIV of France. It had been going on, in various forms, for the better part of a decade. It was expensive in a way that wars with France had a tendency to be. William's treasury was strained to the point of audible complaint. The English government's credit was, to put it diplomatically, uncertain. Previous attempts to raise loans had resulted in terms that were ruinously expensive, when they resulted in anything at all. It was into this atmosphere of royal financial anxiety that William Paterson appeared. Paterson was a Scotsman, born in Dumfriesshire in 1658, educated by his own reading, seasoned by years of trading in the Caribbean and the American colonies. He was not a nobleman. He was not a member of any established financial institution. He was, in the most honest possible description, a projector, a man of ideas, a proposer of schemes, a generator of plans so ambitious that they sometimes crossed the border between vision and fantasy without slowing down. He would later propose the Darien scheme, an attempt to establish a Scottish colony on the Isthmus of Panama that would end in catastrophe, claiming the lives of most of its settlers and a significant portion of Scotland's national wealth. But that was in the future. In 1694, William Paterson had an idea that was not only workable, but, in retrospect, one of the most consequential pieces of financial engineering in the history of the world. The idea was this. A group of private citizens would lend the king £1,200,000, a colossal sum equivalent to roughly half the government's annual revenue, at 8% interest per year. In exchange, the king would grant these private citizens a royal charter to operate as a bank. The bank would be called the Governor and Company of the Bank of England. This sounds, on the surface, like a simple loan agreement. What made it extraordinary was the second half of the arrangement, which almost no one outside the circle of its architects fully grasped at the time. Once the Bank of England had its royal charter, it could issue banknotes, paper promises to pay the bearer a certain sum of gold, in amounts exceeding the actual gold it held in reserve. The principle was exactly the one that those London goldsmiths had stumbled upon. That most people would accept paper in place of gold, and that most of them would not ask for the gold at the same time. The bank could therefore lend out more than it had received, collect interest on the surplus, and used that income to sustain both itself and the interest payments to its depositors. Patterson is reported to have described the mechanism with a frankness that is almost startling. "The bank," he said, "hath benefit of interest on all moneys which it creates out of nothing." Out of nothing. The paper was not a representation of gold that already existed. The paper was a creation of credit, of future value, of promised repayment, of institutional trust, and the creation of that credit was itself a form of money creation. The Bank of England, from its first day of operation, was in the business of manufacturing money. On July 27, 1694, the Bank of England opened its doors in Mercer's Hall in Cheapside, London. It had attracted 1,268 subscribers, ranging from wealthy city merchants to members of the aristocracy. The full sum of £1,200,000 was raised in 12 days, a speed that reflects both the attractiveness of the terms and the desire of London's commercial class to have some formal, institutionalised relationship with the Crown's finances. The early days of the bank were not without difficulty. There were runs on its reserves. There were moments of panic. There was considerable suspicion from the Goldsmith bankers, who recognised correctly that this new institution would eventually compete with and displace them. And there were philosophical objections, most loudly from those who felt that a bank with the power to create money was a mechanism for deception, for producing wealth from air, for enriching its shareholders at the expense of everyone who trusted its notes. These objections were not wrong exactly. They grasped something real about the nature of fractional reserve banking that its defenders often glossed over. But they also missed something equally real, that the creation of credit, the manufacturing of trust into a form that could circulate and do work, was one of the most powerful economic tools that human civilization had ever developed. It could fund hospitals and roads and armies and navies. It could make possible the investment in infrastructure that would eventually produce the Industrial Revolution. It was not simply deception. It was leverage, the amplification of existing wealth into something greater. The question was always whether the leverage would be used wisely. That question, it would turn out, would take centuries to answer, and the answer would change depending on who was asking. In its first decades, the Bank of England became indispensable to the English government in ways that neither party had fully anticipated. The government needed loans. The bank could provide them, at rates that became progressively more favourable as the bank's own creditworthiness became established. The bank needed security. The government provided it, through the political legitimacy that a royal charter conveyed. They had, in effect, fused, not into a single institution, but into a relationship of mutual dependence so tight that neither could fully function without the other. This fusion of private financial interests with the public power of the state is one of the central themes of central banking history. It was never entirely comfortable. The bank's shareholders wanted profits. The government wanted cheap credit. The public wanted stable currency. These interests did not always align, and the history of the Bank of England's first 2 centuries is in large part a history of the negotiation between them, conducted in the language of interest rates and reserve requirements, and, sometimes, outright crisis. But here, in 1694, the architecture was being laid. The foundational bargain had been struck. A government had agreed to entrust a private institution with the management of its credit. In exchange, the institution would act, at least in principle, in the public interest. Whether it actually did so is a question that economists and historians have been arguing about ever since. What is beyond dispute is the practical effect. The Bank of England made it possible for England to borrow money at lower rates than France, its great rival. Over the following century, this advantage would allow England to fund wars, build a navy, and eventually acquire an empire. The bank was not just a financial institution. It was a strategic weapon, and it worked. In the most straightforward sense, England won. The candle in the counting house burns low. The ledger closes for the night. Somewhere across the Channel, in the court of the Sun King, advisers are beginning to wonder if perhaps France needs something similar. And across the ocean, in the drawing rooms of American merchants, men are watching the English experiment with a mixture of admiration and unease. The idea of a bank at the centre of government power was spreading, and not everyone it touched would survive the encounter. What the Bank of England represented in its first decades was a profound and largely unacknowledged shift in the nature of political authority. Before the bank existed, a king who needed money had to go, hat in hand, to the wealthy individuals and trading companies of his realm and negotiate the terms of a loan on their schedule and at their price. The money was theirs. The borrowing was personal in a sense. The king was asking a favour of men who were his social inferiors but his financial superiors, and the relationship was inherently uncomfortable for all concerned. Kings had a well-established tradition of dealing with this discomfort by simply refusing to repay what they had borrowed, a practice that made future borrowing more expensive and more difficult. The Bank of England changed this dynamic in ways that its founders may not have fully appreciated at the time. By pooling the lending capacity of over 1,000 shareholders into a single institution, and by giving that institution a permanent chartered existence, independent of any individual shareholder's life or fortune, it created something genuinely new, a creditor that could outlast any individual king, that could enforce its claims through legal mechanisms rather than personal influence, and that had strong incentives to maintain the creditworthiness of its government borrower, because the bank's own survival depended on the government's ability to service its debts. The result was a kind of mutual hostage arrangement that worked, on the whole, remarkably well. The government needed the bank to raise money. The bank needed the government to provide the legal framework for its operations and to service its debts punctually. Neither could easily destroy the other. And from this uneasy interdependence emerged something that neither party had intended, but that would prove enormously consequential. A state that could borrow reliably, at reasonable rates, over extended periods, because it had committed itself, through the existence of the bank and the bank's claims upon it, to the discipline of repayment. This was not merely a convenience for the English monarchy. It was a strategic advantage of the First Order. England's great rival, France, had a much larger economy, a much larger population, and a much larger army. But France did not have a Bank of England. France had to borrow at higher rates, for shorter terms, under less favourable conditions, because it had not created the institutional architecture of reliable repayment. The consequence was that England, consistently outgunned on land, was able to outlast France in the wars of the 18th century, to sustain the financial burden of conflict longer than its rival, because it could borrow cheaply and reliably what France could not. The financial historian Niall Ferguson has argued that England won its 18th century wars not primarily through military superiority, but through financial superiority, through the ability to borrow more cheaply, for longer. If this is correct, then the Bank of England was not simply a financial institution. It was the hidden engine of British imperial expansion, the institution that made possible the navy, the army, the subsidies to continental allies, and the patient accumulation of colonial territory that would eventually add up to the British Empire, all of it resting ultimately on William Paterson's bargain in 1694. William Paterson himself did not benefit from his creation in the way one might expect. He served as one of the bank's original directors but was removed from the board within a year, following disagreements with his colleagues over management matters that history has not thought important enough to preserve in detail. He pursued the Darien scheme, his vision of a Scottish colony on the Isthmus of Panama, with the same conviction and slightly less success than he had brought to the Bank of England. The Scottish Parliament invested an estimated 1/5 of Scotland's liquid capital in the venture. The colony was devastated by disease, Spanish hostility, and the kind of logistical incompetence that accompanies any enterprise located 8,000 miles from its backer's ability to help. Paterson's wife and child died in Panama. He returned to Scotland in poor health and reduced circumstances, a man who had changed the world and had very little to show for it personally. He spent his later years writing pamphlets on monetary theory and lobbying, with characteristic persistence for various commercial reforms. He supported the Act of Union between England and Scotland in 1707, believing correctly that Scottish merchants would benefit from access to English colonial markets. He received a parliamentary grant in recognition of his contribution to the founding of the bank, which suggests that at least some of his contemporaries understood what he had accomplished. He died in 1719, 1 year before the collapse of the South Sea Bubble, 1 year before the implosion of the Mississippi Scheme. He did not live to see the first great crisis of the system he had helped invent, which is perhaps, given everything, a mercy. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. There are moments in financial history when the most dangerous man in the room is not a villain, but a visionary. A man so far ahead of his contemporaries in his understanding of what money could be, that he outruns not only their comprehension, but his own ability to manage what he has created. John Law was such a man, and the catastrophe he produced in France in the year 1720 was so total, so complete, so perfectly shaped like a cautionary tale, that its echoes would be heard for the next 200 years, including, some historians argue, in the anxious deliberations of those 7 men on Jekyll Island. John Law was born in Edinburgh in 1671, the son of a goldsmith and banker. He was, by all accounts, a man of extraordinary personal charm, a gifted mathematician, a fluent linguist, and an incorrigible gambler. He killed a man in a duel in London in 1694, the same year the Bank of England opened, and fled to the continent to escape the consequences, spending the next 2 decades moving through the gambling tables and royal courts of Europe, winning and losing fortunes with a composure that observers found either admirable or unnerving, depending on their temperament. But Law was not simply a gambler in the ordinary sense. He was a gambler who had developed, during his years of exile and observation, a sophisticated theory about money and credit. He had watched the Bank of England. He had studied the Dutch financial system, the most advanced in Europe, and he had arrived at a conclusion that was genuinely radical for his time, that the amount of money in circulation determined the level of economic activity, and that a nation which confined itself to the amount of gold and silver it happened to possess was unnecessarily limiting its prosperity. In other words, Law believed, rightly in principle, that paper credit, properly managed, could stimulate economic growth in ways that metal currency alone could not. The problem, as France would discover, lay in the phrase properly managed. France in 1715 was in financial ruins. The Sun King, Louis XIV, had died that year after a reign of 72 years, leaving behind a national debt so vast that the government's annual interest payments exceeded its revenues. The Regency, governing on behalf of the child King Louis XV, was desperate. Into this desperation came John Law, with his theory and his charm and his track record of spectacular, if not always sustainable, success. He was permitted to establish the Banque Générale in 1716, France's first proper central bank. It issued paper notes backed by silver coin and was authorized to accept tax payments, which gave its currency immediate practical value. The notes were well managed in the early years. Commerce began to revive. The regent was pleased. Law was trusted. And then Law made his next move, which was brilliant and catastrophic in equal measure. He proposed merging the Banque Générale with the Compagnie des Indes, the Mississippi Company, which held a monopoly on trade with France's vast North American territories, including the Louisiana Territory. The company's theoretical assets were enormous, all of the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Rocky Mountains, plus the fertile delta of the Mississippi River. In practice, very little of this land had been surveyed, settled, or made productive, but Law was selling a vision, and the vision was magnificent. He reorganized the national debt, offering Mississippi Company shares to creditors who would exchange their government bonds for equity. He flooded the market with paper money from the Banque Royale, as the bank was now called, to fund the share purchases. The price of Mississippi Company shares rose from 500 livres in 1694 to 10,000 livres at the peak of the mania in January of 1720. People who had been modestly comfortable became rich beyond their previous imagining. People who had been poor became modestly comfortable. The word millionaire was coined in French at this time to describe the new class of paper wealth that Law had created. The crash, when it came, was equally spectacular. The shares could not sustain their price because the underlying assets, the Mississippi Territory could not generate the revenues that the valuation implied. Investors began to notice. Some of the wealthier ones quietly exchanged their paper for gold and left the country. The bank's gold reserves shrank. When Law tried to restrict the conversion of paper to metal, essentially admitting that the paper was worth less than it claimed, confidence collapsed entirely. By the end of 1720, the Mississippi Company had failed. The Banque Royale had failed. A generation of French middle-class families had been wiped out. John Law fled France in a borrowed carriage, carrying, reportedly, little more than his wits and a diamond he had managed to retain. He died in Venice in 1729, famous, penniless, and in the opinion of many historians, misunderstood. Here is what makes the Mississippi affair genuinely tragic rather than merely scandalous. Law's theory was not wrong. Paper credit backed by productive assets does create economic growth. Central banks issuing currency not fully backed by metal reserves do enable investment that metal-backed systems cannot. These are not the discoveries of madmen. They are the operational principles of every developed economy in the 21st century. Law failed not because his ideas were false, but because he implemented them too quickly in too fragile a political environment, without the institutional checks that might have prevented the mania from spiralling into catastrophe. In England, the same year, an almost identical story played out under the name of the South Sea Bubble. The South Sea Company had been granted a monopoly on trade with Spanish South America, trade that was largely theoretical, since Spain had no intention of allowing English merchants into its colonies. The company's shares rose on the same mixture of patriotic enthusiasm, speculative fever, and government connivance that had inflated the Mississippi scheme. Isaac Newton, one of the great minds of the age, invested and lost, reportedly saying afterward that he could calculate the movements of celestial bodies, but not the madness of men. Both bubbles popped in the same year. Both left their respective countries shaken. But they left a different residue in each place. France's experience with law, the total humiliating collapse of its experiment with paper money and state banking, produced a deep and lasting conservatism about financial innovation that would persist for generations. The word bank became almost toxic in French public life. When the Banque de France was eventually established in 1800, it was done with exceptional caution and explicit structural limits on government interference. England's experience with the South Sea Bubble was painful but survivable. The Bank of England had not been directly involved in the speculative mania. It emerged from the wreckage with its credibility intact, and in fact somewhat enhanced. It had been the institution that had not gone mad. Its steady, conservative presence looked better than it had before the bubble. The lesson England drew was not that banks were dangerous, but that unregulated speculation was. The lesson France drew was darker and more sweeping, and it would cost France dearly in the centuries to come. And yet both lessons pointed toward the same eventual conclusion, that the power of paper money, of credit creation, of centrally managed currency, was too great to be left without oversight. Someone needed to be responsible. Someone needed to hold the line when the madness started. The question of who that someone should be, a private bank, a government agency, or something in between, would not be answered for another 150 years. The fire has burned lower still. The room has grown quieter. Somewhere in the comfortable offices of the Bank of England, the clerks are putting away their ledgers and preparing to go home. The bank has survived its first great test. It has watched a rival nation's experiment explode and learned from the wreckage. But it has not yet learned everything it needs to know. The deeper lessons about when to lend, how much to lend, and what to do when the system itself begins to shake are still in the future. The South Sea Bubble deserves a moment more of attention, because its resolution contained a detail that is rarely remarked upon, but that illuminates something important about how financial systems learn from their mistakes. The bubble's collapse in the autumn of 1720 produced enormous political pressure to punish those responsible. The directors of the South Sea Company, the government ministers who had promoted the scheme, the courtiers who had taken bribes to advance the company's interests. Parliament passed legislation confiscating the directors' estates. Several fled the country. The Postmaster General shot himself. Robert Walpole, who emerged from the chaos as the dominant political figure, conducted what was effectively a whitewash of the most powerful participants in exchange for political support. This was scandalous. It was also, in a peculiar and unintended way, stabilizing. The wealthy investors who had profited from the bubble in its early stages, who had sold their shares before the peak, were not pursued with the same vigor as the directors. Their wealth remained intact. And it is this preserved wealth, the capital that survived the crash, that funded the productive investment of the following decades. England's economy, after a period of genuine distress, recovered with surprising speed. The machinery of commerce was not dismantled. The joint stock company formed despite everything survived and eventually flourished. The lesson drawn was narrow and specific. Do not allow speculative enterprises to become entangled with government debt management in the ways the South Sea Company had been. the lesson drawn was not, do not have a market economy. France drew a much broader lesson and paid a much higher price for it. The collapse of the Mississippi scheme was so total and so identified with the very concept of paper money and joint stock enterprise that France developed an almost allergic response to both for generations. French investors retreated into land, gold, and government bonds. French commercial law remained hostile to the joint stock form. When the Industrial Revolution arrived, France was slower than Britain to mobilize the capital, needed to build railways and factories, because French savings were locked in forms too rigid to be easily converted into investment. The financial trauma of 1720 cast a shadow over French economic development that lasted in some respects well into the 19th century. There is something deeply instructive in this divergence. Two countries experienced almost identical financial catastrophes in the same year. One recovered relatively quickly and drew institutional lessons that, however imperfect, allowed its economy to develop the financial flexibility needed for industrialization. The other was psychologically damaged in ways that produced decades of financial conservatism that impeded growth. The difference was not in the severity of the crisis. France's was arguably worse, but in the institutional response and in the particular cultural interpretation that each society placed upon the event. Money is always, in part, a psychological phenomenon. It is sustained by collective belief, damaged by collective fear, and shaped by the stories that societies tell themselves about what has happened and what it means. The story France told itself about 1720 was, paper money is dangerous, financial innovation is fraud, and the safe place for wealth is in things you can touch. The story England told itself was narrower and more specific, and left more room for the next chapter. Lombard Street is a short, unremarkable road in the heart of the City of London. It runs barely a quarter of a mile between King William Street and Gracechurch Street, lined with the offices of banks and financial houses that have occupied those buildings, in one form or another, for centuries. The street takes its name from the Lombard merchants, from northern Italy, from cities like Milan and Genoa and Florence, who settled in that part of London in the medieval period and made their living as the money changers and bankers of a city that had not yet learned to do those things for itself. By the middle of the 19th century, Lombard Street was the centre of the most sophisticated financial system in the world. The Bank of England stood at one end, its neoclassical columns and thick stone walls conveying the specific kind of confidence that only institutions which have survived multiple crises can radiate. The discount houses, the joint stock banks, the private bankers, the bill brokers, all of them clustered within a few streets of each other, connected by a constant circulation of credit instruments, loans, overnight deposits, and the subtle, continuous negotiation of the money market. It was here, in this dense, intricate, mutually dependent ecosystem of financial institutions, that a Victorian journalist named Walter Bagehot decided to set down, for the first time, a coherent theory of what a central bank was for. Bagehot is not a name that most people recognise today. He is the kind of figure that history tends to file under important but not interesting, which is a serious misclassification. He was, in fact, one of the most perceptive observers of institutional power in the 19th century, a man who could describe the mechanics of constitutional government, the psychology of financial panic, and the social dynamics of English class with equal clarity and equal wit. He edited The Economist for 17 years. He published books on the English Constitution that are still read by political scientists, and in 1873 he published Lombard Street, a description of the money market, which is arguably the most consequential book ever written about central banking. The timing was not accidental. Bagehot was writing in the wake of the Over & Gurney and Company crash of 1866. The failure of what had been the largest discount house in the world, a firm so embedded in the London money market that its collapse had sent tremors through every financial institution in the city. The Bank of England had initially hesitated to intervene, then had intervened, then had been criticised for both decisions. The experience had exposed something important. There was no agreed principle governing what the Bank of England was supposed to do in a crisis. Each emergency was improvised. Each intervention was contested. The bank was the most powerful financial institution in the world, and it had no operating manual. Bagehot intended to write that manual. His central argument was deceptively simple. In a financial crisis, in a moment when fear was spreading through the money markets and institutions were hoarding cash rather than lending it, when the very mechanism of credit was seizing up for want of confidence, the right response was not caution. The right response was generosity. Lend freely, Bagehot said. Lend to any institution that presented sound collateral. Lend at a high rate of interest, so that only those who truly needed the money would come, and so that the bank did not appear to be rewarding recklessness. But lend. Do not hesitate. Do not restrict. Open the doors. The reasoning behind this counterintuitive prescription was precise and elegant. A financial panic is, at its core, a self-fulfilling prophecy. When people believe that a bank will fail, they withdraw their deposits. The withdrawals cause the bank to run short of cash. The shortage confirms the suspicion that the bank is failing. More withdrawals follow. The bank fails. The prophecy fulfills itself. The only way to break this cycle is to eliminate the scarcity that drives it, to make credit so abundantly available that the fear of shortage becomes impossible to sustain. A central bank, Bagehot argued, was uniquely positioned to do this. It was the banker's bank, the institution that held the reserves of all other banks, that could create credit in quantities that no private institution could match, that had the authority and the depth of pockets to stand behind the entire financial system in its moment of maximum vulnerability. This was not a role it had explicitly chosen. It was a role that history had assigned it by making it so central to the network that its failure would be unthinkable, and its survival therefore a public necessity as much as a private interest. Bagehot was not entirely comfortable with this conclusion. He was at heart a believer in the discipline of markets, in the value of letting failure punish foolishness. He worried that a bank that knew it could always call on the central bank for support would take risks it should not take, knowing that the consequences of those risks would be shared with the public. This worry, which economists would eventually formalize under the term moral hazard, is still at the center of every debate about central bank intervention today. It was Bagehot who first gave it clear expression, and yet he accepted the practical necessity. The alternative to a lender of last resort was not a market that disciplined bad behavior. The alternative was periodic catastrophe, waves of bank failures, credit seizures, economic contractions that spread from financial institutions into the real economy with a thoroughness that no philosophy of market discipline could justify. The damage was too indiscriminate, too large, too slow to repair. Some mechanism for absorbing the shock was necessary. The central bank was that mechanism. What Bagehot gave the Bank of England, and by extension all the central banks that would follow, was something more valuable than a set of instructions. He gave it a theory of itself, a story it could tell about what it was for, why it existed, what distinguished it from a simple bank acting in its own interest. The Bank of England was not merely a profitable enterprise that happened to hold the government's account. It was a public institution with a public responsibility, whether or not it was owned by private shareholders. Its purpose was the stability of the system, and the stability of the system was a public good. This was a genuinely new idea. Not entirely without precedent, there were earlier economists who had gestured towards similar conclusions. But Bagehot gave it coherence and authority, and the timing was right. The Victorian financial world was growing more complex, more interconnected, more capable of producing crises that spread faster and wider than anything earlier generations had experienced. The telegraph, the railway, the joint stock company, the global bond market, all of these had created a financial nervous system so sensitive that a disruption in one part could be felt almost instantly across the whole. The doctrine of the lender of last resort was a response to this new reality. In the decades after Lombard Street was published, the Bank of England gradually internalized Bagehot's lesson. It began to think of itself differently, not just as the government's bank, not just as a profitable commercial institution, but as the guardian of financial stability. This shift in self-understanding was subtle and incomplete, and there would be moments, most notably in the early 1930s, when the bank forgot its lessons with ruinous consequences. But the framework was in place, the theory existed, and when a crisis came, there was at least a principle to appeal to, even if the application was always contested and always imperfect. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, A much younger nation was discovering that it had built an economy of extraordinary dynamism and extraordinary fragility, and that it had done so without any institution remotely resembling a central bank. The question of whether America needed something like the Bank of England had been debated since Alexander Hamilton proposed the first Bank of the United States in 1791. It had been answered in the negative, repeatedly and loudly, by a political tradition that mistrusted concentrated financial power with a passion that was equal parts principled and parochial. The repeated financial panics of the 19th century, 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, had not in themselves been enough to change this. Each crisis had been survived eventually through a combination of good luck, private improvisation, and the sheer productive energy of an expanding continental economy. The argument that America was doing fine without a central bank had enough truth in it to remain persuasive. Then came the autumn of 1907, and the argument became very hard to make. Bagehot himself would not live to see how thoroughly his doctrine would be tested, and, in one catastrophic instance, abandoned. He died in 1877, 4 years after Lombard Street was published, at the age of 51. He left behind a body of work that was, for its time, extraordinary in its clarity, and that would prove, in the 20th century more than the 19th, to be genuinely foundational. What Bagehot could not fully address, because the tools did not yet exist to address it, was the question of how a central bank should behave not in a crisis, but in ordinary times. His focus was on the emergency, on the moment when the system was failing and someone needed to act. The question of routine monetary management, of how to use the tools of interest rate policy and money supply management to moderate the business cycle, to prevent inflation, to sustain employment, was a question that required both the theoretical development of the 20th century and the practical experience of the disasters of the 1930s before it could be properly addressed. What he did establish with great clarity was the architecture of responsibility. Someone had to be responsible. Some institution had to be positioned, by virtue of its size and its centrality, to act as the backstop of the financial system. That institution needed to understand that its private interests, its profitability, its shareholders' returns were secondary to its public function. This was the institutional ethos that Bagehot described, and that the Bank of England spent the following 100 years slowly, imperfectly internalizing. The most profound thing Bagehot wrote, and perhaps the least read, was his observation that the existence of a lender of last resort created a paradox. The very availability of the safety net made the system more willing to take risks that made the safety net necessary. If banks knew they could always call on the Bank of England in a crisis, they would hold smaller reserves than they would otherwise need to hold, take on riskier loan portfolios than they would otherwise accept, and operate at the edge of solvency in ways that would be genuinely dangerous if the safety net were ever removed. The safety net, in other words, created the conditions for the fires it was designed to extinguish. This is the paradox that modern economists call moral hazard, and it is as unresolved today as it was when Bagehot first described it. Every expansion of central bank support for the financial system, every bailout, every emergency lending facility, every quantitative easing program, makes the next crisis somewhat more likely by reducing the penalty for risk-taking. Every refusal to intervene makes the current crisis worse by allowing the panic to spread. There is no clean solution. There is only the endless, imperfect negotiation between these two imperatives, conducted under conditions of uncertainty and time pressure that would test the patience and judgment of anyone. This is, ultimately, what central banking is. The house at 219 Madison Avenue was not the largest private residence in New York. There were mansions along Fifth Avenue, the Vanderbilt properties, the Astor houses, that dwarfed it in scale and eclipsed it in fashionable ostentation. But the house belonged to J. Pierpont Morgan, and Morgan was a man who had no particular interest in being fashionable. What he had was an interest in art, in privacy, and in the absolute, unapologetic exercise of financial authority. The house reflected all three. The library attached to it, the room that Morgan had built specifically to house his collection of manuscripts, paintings, and rare books, was perhaps the most impressive private space in America at the time. Its shelves held Gutenberg Bibles and medieval illuminated manuscripts. Its walls were hung with Dutch masters and Italian Renaissance paintings acquired with the directness of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted. The fireplace was large enough to heat the room in all seasons, and the leather chairs arranged before it were deep enough to suggest that a man who sat in them would be there for some time. It was in this room, in October and November of 1907, that J.P. Morgan essentially saved the American economy. And the method he used, the improvised, personal, authoritarian method of a man acting without any institutional framework to support him, was so obviously inadequate to the task that it convinced even his most ardent admirers that something had to change. The crisis of 1907 had multiple origins, as financial crises typically do. There had been a tightening of credit conditions following the earthquake and fire that devastated San Francisco in 1906, which had required enormous insurance payouts that drained gold from the reserves of Eastern banks. There had been a general nervousness in the market following several years of rapid expansion. And there had been a specific precipitating event, the collapse of a scheme by two speculators named F. Augustus Heinze and Charles W. Morse to corner the stock of the United Copper Company. The corner failed. Heinze and Morse were ruined. But they were connected, through a web of directorships and mutual obligations that was typical of the financial practices of the era, to a network of banks and trust companies. When their failure became public, depositors who had accounts at those institutions began to worry. The worry spread, the way worry always spreads in financial systems, faster than information and with less precision. By mid-October, the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the largest and most prestigious trust companies in New York, was facing a run. The Knickerbocker was not directly implicated in the copper corner. Its connection to Heinze and Morse was real but indirect. None of that mattered to the people who had their savings there. What mattered was the fear, and the fear moved faster than any reassurance the company's officers could provide. On October 22, 1907, more than $8 million was withdrawn from the Knickerbocker in a single day. By the afternoon, the company had suspended payments. It was closed. The panic spread. The Trust Company of America was next, then Lincoln Trust. The panic moved through the trust companies of New York with a speed that was genuinely frightening to those who watched it. The stock market began to collapse. The call money rate, the rate at which brokers could borrow overnight to fund stock purchases, rose to 150%. At that price, no one was borrowing. Transactions were freezing. The machinery of the market was seizing up. There was no Federal Reserve. There was no government mechanism for injecting emergency liquidity into a failing system. The Treasury Secretary, George Cortelyou, could deposit some federal funds in New York banks, which he did to the extent of $25 million, but this was a drop in the ocean compared to the scale of the panic. The only institution with the resources, the authority, and the network of relationships to organize a response was not an institution at all. It was a man. Morgan was 70 years old in 1907. He was not in good health. He had been attending a church convention in Richmond, Virginia, when the crisis began, and he had returned to New York on a special train, arriving to find the city's financial community in a state of controlled panic. He went directly to his library, and there, over the following 2 weeks, he essentially became the central bank of the United States. The method was characteristic. Morgan would summon the presidents of the relevant institutions to his library. He would assess the situation with the directness of a man who had spent 60 years dealing with financial reality in its most unvarnished forms. He would determine which institutions were sound and merely illiquid, suffering from a lack of cash flow rather than from actual insolvency, and which were genuinely beyond saving. The solvent but illiquid ones he would organize support for, arranging syndicates of banks to provide temporary loans. The insolvent ones he would allow to fail. This is, more or less, precisely what Bagehot's doctrine prescribed. Lend freely to solvent institutions. Let insolvent ones go. Do not allow a solvent institution to fail simply because of a temporary shortage of cash. The distinction sounds clean in theory. In practice, in the middle of a financial panic, with bank presidents in a state of considerable personal anxiety, with the stock market dropping by the hour, with depositors queuing around city blocks. In practice, making that distinction required a combination of financial expertise, psychological authority, and sheer personal force that very few people possessed. Morgan possessed it. The men who came to his library came knowing that they were dealing with the one person whose opinion was decisive, whose commitment to a plan would make it happen, whose refusal would end it. When Morgan told the presidents of New York's banks that they would each contribute a specific sum to a fund to support the failing trust companies, there was not a great deal of room for negotiation. The story goes, and it is one of those stories that is too characteristic to doubt entirely, that Morgan locked the doors of the library late one night and informed the assembled bankers that they would not leave until they had agreed to the necessary terms. Whether the doors were actually locked is uncertain. That the atmosphere suggested the doors were locked is not. The crisis subsided. Gradually, over a period of several weeks, as Morgan's guarantees and loan arrangements made their way through the system, confidence returned. The panic did not spread to a general banking collapse. The damage was real. The stock market declined sharply, economic activity contracted, and many smaller institutions did not survive. But it was contained. The worst scenarios had been averted. But the episode left a particular discomfort in the minds of thoughtful observers. The American financial system, the engine of the most dynamic economy in the world, had been saved by one man's personal authority and private wealth. Morgan would not always be there. Morgan would die. He died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was created, as though his work were done. What would happen in the next crisis if there were no Morgan? The Senate began to ask this question with some urgency. A National Monetary Commission was established under Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, tasked with studying the financial systems of Europe and making recommendations for reform. Aldrich and his team travelled to England, Germany and France. They studied the Bank of England, the Reichsbank, the Banque de France. They came home with a very clear sense of what the United States was missing, and a much less clear sense of how to provide it in a political environment that had been distrustful of centralized financial power since the days of Andrew Jackson. The political problem was serious. Any proposal for a central bank would immediately attract accusations that it was a gift to the great financial houses of Wall Street. The memory of the first and second banks of the United States, both of which had been destroyed by political opposition, was still alive enough to make congressmen and senators wary. Whatever reform was proposed would need to look sufficiently unlike a central bank that the opponents of central banking could not easily recognize it as one. It was this political requirement, the need to create a central bank that did not look like a central bank, that led, in a roundabout way, to the duck hunting trip. But before the trip, before the politics, there is one more thing worth holding about the panic of 1907. What it revealed about the peculiar position of J.P. Morgan himself, and about the nature of the power he wielded. Morgan was not a government official. He held no elected or appointed position. He had no legal authority to compel the cooperation of the bank presidents who came to his library. His power was entirely a function of the respect and the fear that his reputation and his resources commanded. Men came to his library because they understood that Morgan's opinion about which institutions were salvageable would be decisive. If Morgan said a bank was sound, the market would believe it. If Morgan said it was not, the market would believe that too. His judgment had become, through decades of successful navigation of financial crises, a kind of private currency, a commodity more reliable and more liquid than most of the assets the banks actually held. This is a remarkable thing. The world's most dynamic economy, in the most powerful nation on earth, was being stabilized by the personal credibility of a single 70-year-old man who happened to own a great deal of art and have a very comfortable library. The dependency was not just practical, not just a function of the specific crisis of 1907. It was structural. It reflected the fact that the American system had chosen, repeatedly and explicitly, not to create the kind of institutional infrastructure that would make such personal intervention unnecessary. The choice had been made on democratic grounds. Andrew Jackson had destroyed the Second Bank of the United States in the 1830s because he believed, not entirely wrongly, that it served the interests of a financial elite at the expense of ordinary Americans. The political tradition that flowed from Jackson's victory, the suspicion of concentrated financial power, the hostility to institutions that appeared to give private individuals influence over the public money supply, was a genuine democratic impulse, rooted in genuine historical grievances. But the consequence of that democratic impulse was that when crises came, The system had no institutional mechanism for managing them. It had only the improvised authority of whichever private individuals happened to be wealthy enough and respected enough to fill the gap. In 1907, that individual happened to be Morgan, who was able and willing to act. The next crisis might produce a different Morgan, one less capable or less willing, or simply not present at the right moment. The case for a permanent institution rested not just on efficiency, but on something more urgent: the danger of depending, in moments of national financial crisis, on the benevolence of any single human being. The arrangements were made with considerable care. Senator Nelson Aldrich sent word through private channels. The message was the same in each case. Come to a certain railroad siding in New Jersey at a certain time in the middle of November. Bring enough luggage for 10 days. Tell no one where you're going. Do not travel together. Do not acknowledge each other if you happen to arrive at the same time. And when you're on the train, use only your first names. This last instruction would later seem to some of the participants almost comically conspiratorial. Frank Vanderlip, the president of National City Bank and one of the men who received the summons, wrote about the experience decades later with a mixture of amusement and residual caution. He described the cloak and dagger atmosphere as genuinely necessary. If it had become known that those particular men were meeting to discuss monetary reform, the story would have appeared in every newspaper in the country before they reached their destination, and the political damage would have been considerable. Vanderlip was not exaggerating. The men who gathered at the Hoboken siding on the evening of November 22, 1910, represented a concentration of financial power that was by any measure extraordinary. Aldrich himself was the most powerful figure in the United States Senate on financial matters, the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., deeply connected to the great industrial and financial interests of the Northeast. Harry P. Davison was a senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Company. Vanderlip represented National City Bank, the largest bank in the United States. Benjamin Strong was vice president of Bankers Trust, soon to become the first president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and perhaps the most consequential central banker in American history. Paul Warburg was a partner at Kuhn, Loeb & Company, a German-born banker who had spent a decade arguing, in print and in private conversation, for the establishment of an American central bank modelled on European lines. The seventh member was Abram Piatt Andrew, a Harvard economics professor who had become Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and who served as Aldrich's technical advisor on monetary matters. Together, the institutions these men represented controlled, by some estimates, roughly a sixth of the total money supply of the entire world. They travelled in Aldrich's private rail car, the curtains drawn, the lights low. The porter instructed that there were no passengers for the evening, south through the night, through Maryland and Virginia and the Carolinas, toward the Georgia coast. Jekyll Island was, in 1910, one of the most exclusive private resorts in America. It was owned by the Jekyll Island Club, a membership organization composed entirely of very wealthy individuals: Vanderbilts, Morgans, Pulitzers, Rockefellers. The island sat a few miles off the Georgia coast, accessible only by boat, surrounded by salt marshes that softened the landscape into something dreamlike. In November, with the club season not yet properly begun, the island was almost empty. The servants were instructed to refer to the guests by their first names only, and to ask no questions about who they were. The group settled into the club's main building and went to work. They worked for 10 days. What they produced in those 10 days was a draft document that would eventually, after considerable revision and fierce political battle, become the Federal Reserve Act. The intellectual architecture of that document was primarily the work of Paul Warburg. It was Warburg who had spent years studying the European central banking systems, who had written the most cogent analyses of what the American monetary system lacked, and who had the most clearly formed vision of what was needed. Warburg's diagnosis of the American problem was precise. The United States had a financial system that was rigid when it needed to be elastic, at times of high commercial activity, during the autumn harvest season, for instance, when enormous quantities of credit were needed to move crops from the fields to the markets. The banking system could not expand to meet demand, and interest rates would spike. At times of low activity, the system could not contract to reflect the reduced need, and excess reserves would accumulate in New York banks with nowhere to go. And in times of genuine crisis, as 1907 had demonstrated, there was no mechanism at all for providing emergency liquidity. The solution Warburg had long advocated was a European-style central bank, an institution that could issue currency, hold the reserves of other banks, serve as the lender of last resort, and use its tools to moderate the wild swings between abundance and scarcity that characterized the American money market. The problem was political. Any proposal with the word central bank in its name was dead on arrival in a Congress where the memory of the Second Bank of the United States, destroyed by Andrew Jackson in the 1830s on the grounds that it was a monopoly serving the interests of the wealthy, was still vivid and politically useful. The solution to this political problem was the central insight of the Jekyll Island meeting. Disguise it. Do not call it a central bank. Call it a Federal Reserve System. Do not give it a single locus of power in New York or Washington. Give it 12 regional branches spread across the country so that it could plausibly be described as a decentralized institution responsive to local needs. Do not have it owned by the government, which would raise constitutional objections, but do not leave it purely private either. Create a hybrid structure with private ownership and public oversight. The regional structure was partly genuine and partly theatre. The men at Jekyll Island knew that the New York branch would dominate the system, because New York was where the money was. But the 12-branch structure provided political cover that would prove essential in the congressional debates to come. Senators from the Midwest and the South, who were deeply suspicious of Wall Street, could be told that the Federal Reserve was not Wall Street's bank. It was everyone's bank, distributed fairly across the regions. Vanderlip later described the group's discussions as some of the most intellectually intense of his life. They argued about the details with the concentrated energy of men who understood that the details mattered enormously. Who would own the regional banks? How the reserve requirements would be set? Whether the Federal Reserve notes would be direct obligations of the government or merely obligations of the Federal Reserve banks? How the central board would be constituted and by whom its members would be appointed? These were not merely technical questions. They were questions about the distribution of power. Every design choice embedded an assumption about whose interests the system would serve: the commercial banks that would own shares in the regional Federal Reserve banks, the government that would appoint the central board, the public that would use the currency. The Jekyll Island draft tried to balance these interests. Whether it succeeded is a question that economists and political scientists have been arguing about ever since. The meeting ended. The men left the island separately by different boats as quietly as they had arrived. Aldrich took the draft document north and would spend the following 2 years attempting to shepherd a version of it through Congress, initially under his own name, the Aldrich Plan, which would fail because of Aldrich's too obvious connection to the great banking interests. It would eventually pass in a slightly modified form under the sponsorship of the Wilson administration, which was shrewdly able to present the same basic structure as a progressive reform rather than a Wall Street gift. The secret was kept for decades. It was not until Frank Vanderlip published his memoirs in 1935 that the Jekyll Island meeting was described publicly in any detail. By that time, the Federal Reserve had been in existence for 22 years and was so thoroughly embedded in the American financial architecture that its origins seemed to matter less than its functions. The shock of revelation, if it produced any shock at all, was quickly absorbed. What the meeting had produced would change the world in ways that those 7 men, for all their sophistication, could not have fully foreseen. They had designed an institution. They had not designed the century that institution would have to manage. The island itself deserves a word. Jekyll Island in November was a place of particular beauty. The live oak trees draped in Spanish moss, the marshes catching the low afternoon light in colours that shifted between gold and copper, and a deep, still green. The men who gathered there were not insensible to their surroundings. Vanderlip wrote later that the evenings after the work sessions ended had a quality of strange calm. The remoteness of the place, the absence of telephones and newspapers, and the constant social demands of New York created a kind of enforced concentration that the work required. They ate well. They walked the beaches in the early mornings. They talked, in the evenings, about things other than banking. And then they returned to the table and argued again about reserve ratios and discount rates and the proper relationship between the regional banks and the central board. It is worth pausing on this image. These 7 men, in one of the most beautiful corners of the American coast, designing in careful detail a system that would shape the financial lives of hundreds of millions of people who would never know they were doing it. There is something almost novelistic about it. And yet the image is also deeply ordinary. Important things are designed by small groups of people in places that seem too quiet for the decisions being made in them. The architecture of power rarely announces itself. It assembles in back rooms and library studies and private dining cars, in the company of people who know each other, in the language of those who understand what is being decided. And then it appears, fully formed, apparently inevitable, as though it could not have been otherwise, in the institutions that govern our daily lives. Paul Warburg deserves a particular word here, because he is the least remembered of the Jekyll Island group, and arguably the most important. A member of the Hamburg banking dynasty that had financed European commerce for generations, Warburg had immigrated to the United States in 1902 and had been struck, with the fresh eyes of an outsider, by the peculiar primitiveness of the American monetary system. He began writing about it almost immediately, submitting papers to academic and financial journals, speaking at conferences, lobbying congressmen, with a persistence that his colleagues sometimes found exhausting and that history has vindicated entirely. Warburg understood something that most American bankers did not, because most American bankers had never needed to think about it, that the quality of a nation's monetary system was not simply a technical matter affecting the efficiency of commerce. It was a determinant of the nation's place in the world. Countries with sophisticated, stable monetary systems could borrow internationally at favourable rates, attract foreign investment, and project financial confidence that translated into political influence. Countries without such systems were at the mercy of external conditions they could not manage. Warburg saw the United States, the largest economy in the world, operating with a monetary system that a European banker of modest experience would have found embarrassingly crude. The Federal Reserve Act was, in considerable part, Warburg's vision. The irony of his later career is painful. When the United States entered the First World War against Germany in 1917, Warburg, a German-born naturalized American, with brothers still living in Hamburg, found his position on the Federal Reserve Board untenable. He resigned. He spent the remaining years of his life in a kind of painful position between two worlds. American enough to have built the institution that shaped American finance for a century. German enough to be suspect in a country at war with Germany, he died in 1932, the year before Franklin Roosevelt took office, and began the reforms that would complete what Warburg had started. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The evening of December 23, 1913 was cold and clear in Washington. Congress had been in session for weeks in an atmosphere of considerable exhaustion and considerable political tension. The holiday recess was imminent. Many members had already made their travel arrangements. The galleries were sparsely attended. The reporters in the press section had the somewhat distracted air of men who were covering a formality. What they were covering was not a formality. When President Woodrow Wilson put his signature to the Federal Reserve Act on that December evening, he was completing a legislative journey that had begun, in practical terms, on a private island off the Georgia coast 3 years before, and that had begun, in historical terms, with a Scottish financier's conversation with a desperate king 2 centuries before that. The Federal Reserve System came into existence in a quiet room, on a quiet evening, at the end of a year that had already produced an unusual amount of history. The path from Jekyll Island to Wilson's desk had been neither straight nor simple. Senator Aldrich's original plan, the direct descendant of the Jekyll Island draft, had been introduced in Congress in early 1911 and had died quickly. The political timing was wrong. The Peugeot Committee, a congressional investigation into the concentration of financial power in America, had been generating disturbing testimony about the connections between the great banking houses and the industries they financed. The committee's chief counsel, Samuel Untermeyer, had interrogated J.P. Morgan himself with a directness that was unusual for the era, and that had produced memorable exchanges about the nature of financial trust and the limits of accountability. In this atmosphere, any proposal associated with Aldrich, who was widely known as the representative of banking interests in the Senate, was politically toxic. The Aldrich plan did not pass, but the substantive problem it was trying to address had not gone away. The American monetary system still lacked a lender of last resort. The panic of 1907 had not been forgotten. Something needed to be done. The Wilson administration provided the something. Carter Glass of Virginia in the House, and Robert Owen of Oklahoma in the Senate were the chief legislative architects of what became the Federal Reserve Act. They worked with a Treasury Secretary named William Gibbs McAdoo and with a brilliant young economist named H. Parker Willis, who did much of the technical drafting. The bill they produced was substantially similar in its structural architecture to the Aldrich Plan, which caused considerable irony when the banking interests who had loved the Aldrich Plan found reasons to oppose the Glass-Owen bill, and when the progressives who had opposed the Aldrich Plan found reasons to support it. The political rebranding was skillful. The Federal Reserve System would have 12 regional banks, not one central institution. The member banks, the commercial banks that joined the system, would own shares in their regional Federal Reserve Bank, but this ownership would not translate into control in any meaningful sense. The Federal Reserve Board in Washington, with members appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, would hold ultimate authority over policy. The currency to be issued, Federal Reserve notes, would be obligations of the Federal Reserve banks but would carry the backing of the United States government. This hybrid construction was, as its architects well understood, somewhat awkward as a matter of pure institutional logic. The Federal Reserve was not fully public and not fully private. Its regional banks were owned by commercial banks, which were private profit-seeking entities. Its governing board was a government appointment. Its mission was a public one. These elements did not always fit together neatly, and the history of the Federal Reserve's first century would be shaped, in part, by the recurring effort to determine which of these identities was primary. The question that a visitor to Washington in 1913 might have asked, who does this institution actually serve, was one that the architects of the Act were careful not to answer too directly. The system would serve everyone, they said. It would serve the banks that needed liquidity. It would serve the government that needed an efficient monetary system. It would serve the public that needed price stability and full employment. Whether any single institution could genuinely serve all of these interests simultaneously was a question that would generate a century's worth of argument. Woodrow Wilson signed the bill and expressed, in his public remarks, considerable satisfaction. He had presided over a significant reform. He had broken the monopoly of private banking interests over the American monetary system, or at least he believed he had. The newspapers were largely favourable. The bankers were cautiously accepting. The progressives were cautiously satisfied. What Wilson said in private was a different matter. In letters and conversations over the following years, Wilson expressed growing unease about what he had created. The most frequently cited passage, in which he allegedly wrote that he had unwittingly ruined his country by creating a system that placed power over credit in the hands of a small group of dominant men, is almost certainly apocryphal in its specific wording. It does not appear in Wilson's collected papers, but the sentiment is not invented. Wilson did express, in documented correspondence and public speeches in the years after 1913, a genuine anxiety about the concentration of financial power and about whether the Federal Reserve, as structured, had adequately addressed it. The Federal Reserve began operations in November 1914, in the middle of a world war that had disrupted the international gold flows on which the existing monetary system depended. Its early years were a mixture of learning and improvisation. The institution did not yet have a clear understanding of what its tools could do, let alone what they should do. The 12 regional banks operated with considerable autonomy. The Federal Reserve Board in Washington had less authority than its architects had intended, and no one, not the bankers, not the economists, not the politicians, fully understood the new institution's relationship with the gold standard, which still nominally governed the international monetary system. Benjamin Strong, who became president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 1914 and would hold that position until his death in 1928, was perhaps the most important figure in the institution's early history. Strong was a practical man with an instinctive grasp of monetary mechanics. He understood that the New York Fed, as the bank that dealt directly with foreign central banks and with the international gold market, would inevitably be the dominant institution within the system. He used that position to develop the Fed's monetary tools, particularly open market operations, the buying and selling of government securities, to influence the supply of money and credit in ways that would become central to central banking practice everywhere. But Strong died in 1928, and without his authority and experience to guide it, the Federal Reserve would make, in the 3 years that followed, the most consequential series of policy errors in its history. The story of those errors, of how the institution designed to prevent the kind of financial collapse that had devastated America in 1907 managed to oversee a financial collapse that was almost incomparably worse, is one of the most studied and debated episodes in economic history. It is also, in a certain sense, the story of what happens when the theory is right, but the men implementing it are uncertain, divided, and working with tools they do not yet fully understand. The night has grown deep and still. The Federal Reserve System exists now, woven into the architecture of American financial life. Its creation is complete, but the work it was created to do, the hard, imperfect, never fully finished work of managing a monetary system in a world of constant change, is only just beginning. The structure that the Federal Reserve Act created was genuinely novel, unlike any central bank that had come before. The Bank of England was a single institution, privately owned but deeply intertwined with the state. The Banque de France, reconstituted in 1800, was government-chartered and government-supervised. The Reichsbank of Germany was essentially an arm of the German imperial government. The Federal Reserve was none of these things precisely. It was a network, 12 regional banks, each owned by the commercial banks in its district, each with its own board of directors, each with considerable operational autonomy, overseen by a Federal Reserve Board in Washington, whose authority was real, but whose day-to-day influence over the regional banks was, in the early years, limited. This structure reflected the deep ambivalence of American political culture towards centralized power of any kind. The progressives who had forced through the legislation wanted public accountability. The bankers who had designed the Jekyll Island draft wanted private control. The farmers and small business owners of the Midwest and South wanted the new institution to serve their credit needs rather than those of the New York financial establishment. The compromise satisfied none of these constituencies fully, which is perhaps why it survived. It was weak enough in any single direction that no single group could claim it entirely as its own. The question of who the Federal Reserve actually serves has been asked, in one form or another, in every decade since 1913. The original structure gave commercial banks, private, profit-seeking entities, formal ownership of the regional Federal Reserve banks and a role in selecting their presidents. Critics argued then and since that this structure gave private banking interests undue influence over what was supposed to be a public institution. Defenders argued that the alternative, a central bank entirely under government control, was more dangerous because governments had even stronger incentives to use monetary policy for short-term political advantage. Both of these concerns are genuine. Both have been vindicated, at different moments, by historical experience. The Federal Reserve's early years were dominated by New York banking interests in ways that sometimes served those interests at the expense of the broader public. The hyperinflations of the interwar period in Germany and elsewhere demonstrated what happens when governments control the printing press without institutional constraint. The tension between these two failure modes, private capture and political abuse, has shaped central bank design in every country that has established one since 1913. The Federal Reserve Act itself was silent on many of the questions that would matter most. It did not specify what the Federal Reserve's ultimate objectives were. It did not explain how the 12 regional banks and the Washington Board should coordinate their policies. It did not address the relationship between the Fed's monetary policy and the government's fiscal policy. These silences were not accidental. They reflected the limits of what political consensus could achieve in 1913. Filling in the silences would be the work of the next century. There is a particular cruelty in institutional failure that is distinct from individual failure. When a person makes a catastrophic error of judgment, the consequences, however terrible, are bounded by the scale of one person's influence. When an institution makes a catastrophic error of judgment, an institution that governs the monetary conditions of an entire economy, the consequences spread through every household, every workshop, every farm, every small shop and large factory in the nation. They spread to children who have never heard of monetary policy and to old people who did nothing wrong. They spread to every corner of economic life with an impartiality that is almost indistinguishable from cruelty. This is what the Federal Reserve did between 1929 and 1933. It made decisions, not malicious decisions, not corrupt decisions, but decisions that reflected a genuine misunderstanding of the situation that transformed what might have been a severe but manageable recession into the worst economic catastrophe in the history of the modern world. The story of the Great Depression is a story that has been told many times, from many angles, And it is not entirely what this evening's narrative is about. What concerns us here is the specific role of the central banks, the Federal Reserve, yes, but also the Bank of England, in the events of those years. Because the monetary authorities of the 1930s did not merely fail to prevent the Depression. In crucial ways, they made it worse. The mechanism by which they made it worse was identified with great precision decades later by the economists Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz in their landmark 1963 work, A Monetary History of the United States. Friedman and Schwartz demonstrated, through exhaustive analysis of the monetary data, that between 1929 and 1933 the Federal Reserve allowed, in some cases actively caused, a contraction of the money supply of approximately one-third. $1 in 3 simply disappeared from the American economy. Banks failed by the thousands. Their depositors lost their savings. The money those savings represented ceased to exist in any practical sense. The Federal Reserve, faced with exactly the kind of banking crisis it had been created to prevent, did not do what Bagehot had prescribed. It did not lend freely. It raised interest rates in 1931, in the middle of the Depression, when the economy was already contracting, in an effort to defend the gold standard and attract foreign capital. It allowed bank after bank to fail without intervention. It watched the money supply contract and treated the contraction as a sign of necessary adjustment, rather than as an emergency requiring response. Why? This is the question that haunts the historical record of those years. Why did the Federal Reserve, staffed by intelligent men who had read Bagehot and who had witnessed the aftermath of 1907, make choices so precisely calibrated to produce the worst possible outcome? The answers are multiple and interrelated. Benjamin Strong, the one figure in the Federal Reserve System who might have had both the authority and the understanding to act differently, had died in 1928. His successors were less decisive, more divided, more uncertain about what the tools of monetary policy could actually do. The Federal Reserve Board in Washington and the regional bank presidents were frequently in disagreement. The gold standard imposed constraints that seemed absolute. If you allowed the dollar to depreciate against gold, foreign investors would withdraw their capital, gold would flow out, and the reserves that back the currency would shrink. And there was a philosophical disposition, common among central bankers of the era, that some degree of liquidation, some purging of the excesses of the 1920s boom, was necessary and correct. This view, associated most strongly with Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, who famously advised Hoover to liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate, was cruel in a way that its advocates did not recognize, because they were looking at aggregate economic quantities rather than at the human beings those quantities represented. In England, a parallel drama was playing out. The Bank of England had returned Britain to the gold standard in 1925 at the pre-war parity of $4.86 to the pound, a rate that the economist John Maynard Keynes had argued publicly and very loudly was too high. At that exchange rate, British goods were expensive on world markets, British exports suffered, unemployment rose, and the Bank of England was forced to maintain high interest rates to keep the pound competitive at its official level. The bank held the line with considerable institutional dignity and considerable human cost. The crisis came in September 1931. A wave of European bank failures, beginning with the collapse of the Austrian bank Creditanstalt in May, had sent gold flowing from London as foreign investors withdrew funds. The Bank of England's gold reserves, which had never been comfortable, were being drained at a rate that could not be sustained. The bank raised interest rates. It arranged emergency loans from the Bank of France and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. None of it was sufficient. On September 21, 1931, the Bank of England suspended gold convertibility. The pound was allowed to fall. Britain had left the gold standard. The departure from gold was, paradoxically, the beginning of Britain's recovery. Free from the obligation to maintain a fixed exchange rate, the Bank of England could reduce interest rates. Cheaper money stimulated investment and housing construction. The economy began, slowly, to recover. The austerity that had been necessary to defend the gold standard, the cuts in government spending, the suppression of wages, the high unemployment, became unnecessary once the gold standard was gone. Other countries watched Britain leave gold and drew the obvious conclusion. One by one, the major economies abandoned the gold standard through the 1930s. The United States followed in 1933, when President Franklin Roosevelt suspended gold payments and devalued the dollar. the decision was controversial and almost certainly illegal under existing statutes. It was also almost certainly correct. The American economy's recovery, slow, incomplete, interrupted by the recession of 1937, which was caused in part by premature tightening of fiscal and monetary policy, would have been even slower and more incomplete under the gold constraint. The experience of the 1930s had a profound effect on the theory and practice of central banking. Friedman and Schwartz's later analysis, which assigned primary responsibility for the depression severity to the Federal Reserve's monetary contraction, was not universally accepted. Keynesians argued that the problem was fundamentally one of insufficient demand, which monetary policy alone could not address. The debate between these two schools of thought would shape economic policy debates for the remainder of the 20th century. But there was one lesson from the 1930s on which nearly everyone eventually agreed. A central bank that allowed the money supply to collapse in the face of a banking panic had failed its most basic purpose. The lender of last resort had stood by while the last resort burned. Whatever else a central bank might debate about its role and its tools, this particular failure, this particular abdication, was not to be repeated. When the financial crisis of 2008 struck, the first response of Ben Bernanke, the Federal Reserve chairman who had spent his academic career studying the Great Depression, was to open every available channel of liquidity with a speed and scale that would have made Bagehot's heart sing. Whether Bernanke's response was too large, too small, or precisely calibrated is a debate that economists will be having for decades. But it was emphatically not the response of 1931. The lesson had been learned, or at least this particular lesson had been learned. The room around you has settled into something very quiet now. The fire has burned to embers. The years of reckoning are behind us, and somewhere in the mountains of New Hampshire, in the summer of 1944, a group of Allied nations are gathering in a grand hotel to design the monetary system for the world that the war is about to leave behind. There is one more detail of the interwar years that deserves to be held quietly before we leave them. In the autumn of 1931, as the Bank of England was suspending gold convertibility and the world's monetary system was fragmenting, a young economist named John Maynard Keynes sat in his rooms in Cambridge and wrote what would become one of the most widely quoted passages in the history of economic thought. He was describing the gold standard, the system that was then collapsing around him, and he called it a barbarous relic. The phrase was memorable and slightly unfair, but it captured something real about the way the gold standard had, in the conditions of the 1930s, imposed a deflationary discipline that no democratic society could endure. Keynes had been arguing for more than a decade that the gold standard was not the neutral automatic stabilizer that its defenders claimed. It was a political choice, embedded in law and custom and international agreement, and like all political choices, it had winners and losers. The winners, in the gold standard world, were creditors, those who held money-denominated assets, who benefited from the price stability that the gold constraint imposed, whose wealth was protected from the inflation that debtor governments might otherwise choose to generate. The losers were debtors, including, at the national level, any country that found itself in a recession and was prevented by the gold constraint from stimulating its economy through monetary expansion. What the 1930s demonstrated at enormous human cost was that the gold standard's discipline could not be maintained when the social and political consequences of that discipline became unbearable. The theory said that wages should fall, that prices should fall, that the economy should adjust to the new conditions of deflation and find a new equilibrium at a lower level of activity. The reality was that wages did not fall easily. Workers resisted, unions organised, governments faced electoral pressure, and the attempt to force them down through monetary contraction produced unemployment on a scale that threatened the legitimacy of the entire capitalist order. Franklin Roosevelt understood this, instinctively if not theoretically, in a way that the financial establishment did not. His decision to take the United States off gold in 1933 was technically illegal, broadly denounced by the economic orthodoxy of the time, and almost certainly correct. The price level stabilized. The deflationary spiral ended. The economy began the long, slow, uneven process of recovery. The lesson, that monetary policy needed to serve human welfare rather than the other way around, was one that would eventually reshape the theory and practice of central banking. But it would take another catastrophe in 2008 to make that lesson truly operational. The Mount Washington Hotel had seen better days. It sat at the base of the White Mountains in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, a Victorian confection of white clapboard and red roofing, surrounded by forests that were green in summer and deep with snow in winter. It had been built in 1902 for the wealthy vacationers of the Gilded Age, the kind of people who travelled north from Boston and New York to escape the summer heat and conduct their leisure with the same methodical seriousness with which they conducted their business. By 1944, after 2 decades of depression and war, those guests had become a memory. The hotel was operating on reduced means, its grandeur slightly tarnished, its staff smaller than it had once been. In July of 1944, the hotel was filled to capacity. 730 delegates from 44 allied nations had arrived for the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, the gathering that would become known for the next 80 years and beyond simply as Bretton Woods. They arrived in the middle of a world war that was visibly turning toward Allied victory but had not yet ended. They arrived with a collective understanding that the monetary disorder of the interwar years, the competitive devaluations, the trade barriers, the fragmentation of the international economy into hostile currency blocks, had contributed in significant ways to the conditions that had made the war possible. They arrived determined not to let it happen again. The 2 men who dominated the conference were, in almost every conceivable respect, opposites. John Maynard Keynes was 60 years old, English, aristocratic in manner if not entirely in origin, brilliant to the point of occasional arrogance, and in poor health. He was the most famous economist in the world, author of the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, which had rewritten the intellectual foundations of macroeconomics in the 1930s, and which had provided the theoretical justification for the kind of active government intervention that Roosevelt's New Deal had practiced. He came to Bretton Woods as the chief British representative, tasked with negotiating a post-war monetary system that would serve British interests, which meant, above all, a system that would allow Britain to rebuild its economy without being trapped by the constraints of a fixed exchange rate. Harry Dexter White was 53, American, the son of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants, largely self-made, considerably less elegant in style than Keynes, and considerably more powerful in the specific context of Bretton Woods. He was the chief international economist of the United States Treasury, working under Henry Morgenthau Jr., and he had spent the war years designing America's vision for the post-war monetary order. He came to the conference knowing that the United States held all the cards. It was the world's largest creditor nation, it held the majority of the world's gold, and its industrial economy had not been destroyed by the war. Whatever system emerged from Bretton Woods would be structured around American interests and American power. White intended to ensure that this was understood. Keynes had arrived with his own proposal, a plan for an international clearing union, a supranational institution that would issue a new international currency, which he called the Bancor, and which would be used to settle trade imbalances between nations. The genius of the Banker proposal lay in its symmetry. Both creditor nations and debtor nations would face pressure to adjust their trade imbalances. A country running persistent trade surpluses, accumulating bankers, would pay a penalty on the excess, creating an incentive to increase imports and reduce the surplus. A country running persistent deficits would face the usual pressure to reduce spending. The burden of adjustment in Keynes's system would be shared. White had a different proposal, and White's proposal reflected the reality of power more accurately than Keynes's reflected the elegance of theory. In White's vision, which was the vision that prevailed, there would be no Bancor. The anchor of the international monetary system would be the United States dollar, which would be convertible to gold at the fixed rate of $35 per troy ounce. All other currencies would be pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates, adjustable only in cases of fundamental disequilibrium, with the agreement of the new international institution to be created at the conference. That institution would be called the International Monetary Fund. A second institution, to finance post-war reconstruction, would be called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which would become the World Bank. For the United States, the Bretton Woods system was almost perfectly designed. The dollar would become the world's reserve currency, meaning that every central bank in the world would hold dollars as the bedrock of its monetary reserves. Every commodity on international markets would be priced in dollars. Every trade settlement would flow through dollar accounts. The United States would gain what the French economist Valéry Giscard d'Estaing would later, and memorably, call an exorbitant privilege, the ability to finance its own deficits by issuing obligations denominated in the currency that the rest of the world was obligated to hold. For Britain, and for the other European nations that came to Bretton Woods hoping to shape a system that would give them room to rebuild, the outcome was less satisfying. The sterling area, which had allowed Britain to manage its trade and currency relationships with its empire in relative independence, would be gradually dissolved. Britain would receive a large American loan, but it came with conditions, including convertibility of sterling, that proved economically damaging when they were implemented in 1947 and had to be quickly reversed. Keynes accepted the outcome with considerable unhappiness, and with the grace of a man who understood that the negotiating position he had brought to Bretton Woods was ultimately a weak one. Britain was exhausted and deeply in debt. America was strong. The system would reflect that reality regardless of the elegance of British counter-proposals. He returned to England and died of a heart attack in April 1946, not quite 2 years after the conference ended. The Bretton Woods system came into full operation in the late 1940s and remained the architecture of international monetary relations for the following quarter-century. It was a period of remarkable financial stability. Exchange rates were fixed, capital flows were controlled, inflation was moderate, and the industrialized economies grew at rates that had no precedent in history and have not been equaled since. Whether this stability was caused by the Bretton Woods system or merely coincided with it is disputed. But the coincidence was striking enough that the post-war decades have acquired, in retrospect, an almost golden quality in the memories of economists who study them. The system had a structural flaw, however, that was identified early and proved ultimately fatal. Robert Triffin, a Belgian-American economist, described it in testimony to Congress in 1960. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency required the United States to supply dollars to the rest of the world, to run trade deficits so that other countries could accumulate the dollar reserves they needed. But if the United States ran persistent trade deficits, its gold reserves would eventually become insufficient to back the dollars outstanding at the agreed rate of $35 per ounce. And if that insufficiency became apparent to foreign governments, if they began to doubt that they could actually get $35 worth of gold for every dollar they held, they would rush to exchange their dollars for gold before the rate was changed. The ensuing run would destroy the system. This was Triffin's dilemma. The dollar's global role required American deficits, and American deficits would eventually destroy the dollar's credibility. The system contained, built into its foundations, the mechanism of its own destruction. Throughout the 1960s, the dilemma became increasingly visible. President Charles de Gaulle of France, who mistrusted American financial hegemony with a vividness that was almost aesthetic, began systematically converting French dollar reserves to gold. Other countries began to follow. The American gold stock fell steadily through the decade. By 1971, the United States held gold reserves of roughly $10 billion against outstanding foreign dollar claims of more than $40 billion. The gap could no longer be ignored. In the summer of 1971, President Richard Nixon and his advisors gathered at Camp David to discuss what to do. The options were limited and unpleasant. There was no good solution, only less bad ones. On August 15th, a Sunday evening, Nixon appeared on national television to announce what he called the new economic policy. Most of the announcements concerned domestic economic matters, wage and price controls, a surcharge on imports. But buried in the speech was the decisive sentence: the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. The gold window was closed. The foreign governments who held dollars received no advance warning. The French, who had been systematically exchanging dollars for gold under de Gaulle's policy, and who had a ship carrying gold reportedly en route to Fort Knox when the announcement was made, were furious. The Germans, whose central bank had been warning for months that the Bretton Woods system was under terminal pressure, were less surprised, but no less affected. The Japanese, whose economy had been built on export surpluses accumulated in dollars, faced the immediate prospect of their currency rising sharply against the dollar and their export competitiveness declining overnight. The reaction of the foreign exchange markets in the days that followed the announcement was, in its way, one of the most extraordinary financial events of the 20th century. Dealers in currency trading rooms across Europe and Asia faced a situation for which there was no historical precedent and no established procedure. The anchor of the international monetary system, the fixed price of gold in dollars that had been unchanged since 1934, had simply been removed. What was a dollar now worth? In terms of what could it be measured? The answer, floating, moving, determined by market supply and demand in a system that had not been designed for this purpose, was genuinely disorienting to institutions that had spent a quarter-century operating on the assumption of fixed rates. The Bretton Woods system had lasted 27 years. Compared to the interwar chaos it had replaced, this was a long run. Compared to the ambitions of its founders, who had hoped to create something durable enough to outlast the memory of the people who built it was a disappointment. But it had served its purpose. The post-war reconstruction of Europe and Japan had been completed. The liberal trading order had been established. The international monetary institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, had acquired enough institutional weight to survive the collapse of the system that had given birth to them and to continue functioning in the new, less orderly world that followed. The foreign exchange markets reopened on Monday, August 16, 1971, to a world in which the rules had changed overnight. The dollar fell. Not catastrophically, not in the manner of a currency that has lost the confidence of markets entirely, but with the quiet, purposeful movement of something that has been overvalued for years and has finally been allowed to find its natural level. The currencies of Germany and Japan and the other major trading partners of the United States rose against the dollar. The gold price, no longer fixed by American policy, began its long ascent from $35 per ounce toward levels that would eventually seem, to those who had experienced the Bretton Woods era, almost fictional. The closure of the gold window was initially framed as a temporary measure. Nixon spoke of a new economic policy, of negotiations to come, of a reformed international monetary system that would replace Bretton Woods with something equally stable, but better adapted to current realities. The Smithsonian Agreement of December 1971 attempted to establish new fixed exchange rates. It lasted 14 months. By March 1973, the major currencies were floating, moving against each other in response to market forces rather than fixed by government agreement. The world had entered the era of fiat money. Not for the first time, the word fiat means by decree in Latin, and there had been many episodes in history in which governments had declared their currency to be money without backing it with gold or silver. But this was the first time in the modern era that the entire international monetary system, by collective default rather than explicit agreement, had abandoned any commodity anchor. Money was now what government said it was, backed by nothing except the productive capacity of the economies that issued it, and the willingness of the world to accept it as payment. This was, depending on your perspective, either an act of liberation or an act of recklessness. For those who believed that the gold standard had imposed necessary discipline on governments, preventing them from inflating their currencies to finance spending that taxpayers would not otherwise approve, the end of Bretton Woods was a disaster waiting to happen. For those who believed that the gold standard had been a cage, limiting governments' ability to respond to economic crises and imposing unnecessary deflation on economies that needed expansion, it was an overdue correction. The 1970s offered evidence for both views simultaneously, which is one of the things that makes the decade so instructive. Freed from the gold constraint, the major central banks of the world proved initially unable, or unwilling, to maintain price stability. Inflation, already rising in the late 1960s, accelerated sharply through the 70s. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 contributed. But monetary policy choices also contributed, in ways that Milton Friedman had predicted and that event confirmed. Without a commodity anchor, the discipline of monetary policy depended entirely on the willingness of central banks to impose it on themselves. And in the 1970s, that willingness was insufficient. The task of imposing it fell to Paul Volcker. Appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve by President Jimmy Carter in 1979, Volcker was a large, deliberate man who smoked cheap cigars and had an economist's clarity about what needed to be done. What needed to be done was painful: raise interest rates high enough and keep them there long enough to squeeze inflation out of the American economy regardless of the short-term economic cost. Volcker raised the federal funds rate to 20% in 1981, a level that induced a sharp recession, produced unemployment rates exceeding 10%, and generated fierce political opposition from industries and constituencies that depended on cheap credit. He held the line. Inflation fell from 13% in 1979 to 3% by 1983. The recession ended, the economy recovered, and in the aftermath of Volcker's disinflation, something changed in the relationship between central banks and the societies they served. What changed was the recognition, not universal and never uncontested, but widely enough shared to reshape institutional practice, that monetary stability was a public good, that central banks were uniquely positioned to provide, and that providing it required a degree of independence from day-to-day political pressures. Elected politicians, for understandable reasons, prefer low unemployment to low inflation in the short run, even if the long-run consequence of tolerating inflation is economic instability. Central banks, insulated from electoral pressures, could make the longer-run calculation and act on it consistently. The doctrine of central bank independence, the idea that monetary policy decisions should be made by technocratic experts at arm's length from government, became the dominant paradigm of central banking through the 1980s and 90s. The Bank of England was formally granted operational independence in 1997 under the new Labour government, allowing it to set interest rates without Treasury approval for the first time in its 300-year history. Central banks in New Zealand, Canada, Sweden, and many other countries adopted explicit inflation targets, numerical commitments that anchored public expectations and provided a clear standard against which the central bank could be held accountable. The era that followed, what economists called the Great Moderation, was a period of unusually low economic volatility in the developed world. Inflation was tame, recessions were mild, growth was steady if not spectacular. Central bankers achieved a degree of public prestige that their predecessors would have found remarkable. Alan Greenspan, who chaired the Federal Reserve from 1987 to 2006, was described by admirers as the maestro, a word that carried connotations of almost magical expertise. And then 2008 arrived, and a great deal of the confidence that the previous 20 years had generated was abruptly, brutally revised. The financial crisis of 2008 was, in its immediate mechanics, the kind of crisis that Bagehot would have recognized immediately. A system-wide loss of confidence in financial institutions, a seizure of interbank lending, a cascade of asset price declines that threatened to become self-reinforcing. Ben Bernanke, who had studied the Great Depression and who understood, in precise technical terms, what the Federal Reserve of 1931 had done wrong, responded with an openness and a speed that was without precedent. The Fed's balance sheet expanded from under $1 trillion to over $4 trillion in a few years. Interest rates were reduced to essentially zero and held there for years. New tools, quantitative easing, forward guidance, emergency lending facilities of baroque complexity, were deployed to prevent the kind of monetary contraction that had turned a crisis into a catastrophe in the 1930s. The immediate catastrophe was prevented. The banking system did not collapse. But the recovery was slow, uneven, and deeply uncomfortable to large portions of the population who felt, not unreasonably, that the institutions responsible for the crisis had been rescued while ordinary families bore the consequences. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expansion and the asset price inflation it contributed to primarily benefited those who owned financial assets, the wealthy. Those who owned primarily their labour found the recovery less visible. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 produced the next great test. The Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet to nearly $9 trillion. The Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan all undertook programs of comparable scale relative to their economies. Fiscal and monetary policy worked in concert in ways that would have seemed almost unthinkable to the inflation-scarred central bankers of the 1980s. The immediate economic collapse was contained. The subsequent inflation, peaking in many countries at the highest rates in 40 years, was the cost. Which brings us quietly to the present. 330 years after William Paterson made his bargain with a desperate king, the institutions he helped establish still sit at the centre of the world economy. They are more complex, more powerful, more globally interconnected than anything Paterson could have conceived. They face challenges, the transition away from fossil fuels, the digital disruption of finance, the rise of cryptocurrencies that challenged the state monopoly on money, that their founders could not have imagined. And they still face the fundamental questions that were present at the beginning. Whose interests do they serve? How much independence from democratic accountability is appropriate for institutions wielding so much power? Can a system designed to make the inevitable crises of capitalism manageable also address the structural inequalities that capitalism produces? These questions were asked in 1694, and in 1720, and in 1913, and in 1944, and in 2008. They will be asked again. The answers are never finished. They are always provisional, always contested, always subject to revision by the next crisis that arrives, as crises always do, in forms that the existing frameworks were not quite prepared to manage. The fire is very low now. The room is very quiet. The long history of central banking has settled around you like the cool air of a late evening, and there is something almost peaceful in the recognition that the systems we inherit are imperfect, and always have been, and that the people who built them were trying, in their various flawed and interesting ways, to solve problems they had not quite solved before. What the 21st century has revealed, above all, is how much depends on the credibility of the central bank itself, on the collective belief, sustained across millions of daily transactions, that the institution will do what it has said it will do. Credibility is not a technical property. It is not written in the charter or enforced by the law. It is earned over time through consistent behaviour, through the willingness to make unpopular decisions when the situation demands them, through the demonstration, repeated and specific and sometimes costly, that the institution will not simply tell people what they want to hear. The Federal Reserve lost credibility in the 1970s by tolerating inflation for too long. It recovered credibility through Volcker's painful disinflation in the early 80s. The Bank of England lost credibility on a single afternoon in September 1992, Black Wednesday, when speculative pressure forced Britain to abandon its participation in the European exchange rate mechanism and devalue the pound, and recovered it, more slowly, through the inflation-targeting framework that followed. Credibility once lost is expensive and slow to rebuild. This is one reason why central bankers tend toward conservatism, toward promises they are confident they can keep, rather than toward ambitious commitments that might require revision. And yet the events of 2008 and of 2020 have pushed central banks toward commitments that would have seemed impossibly ambitious to their predecessors. The Fed's pledge to keep rates near zero until specific employment and inflation targets were met. The European Central Bank's commitment to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro, a phrase of 6 words that Mario Draghi uttered in the summer of 2012 and that, almost alone, ended the European sovereign debt crisis by persuading markets that the ECB would back its words with unlimited action. These are not the cautious, qualified statements of institutions worried about overcommitting. They are bold declarations, staking institutional credibility on outcomes that cannot be fully controlled. Whether this boldness is appropriate, sustainable, and democratic, whether institutions that were designed as backstops for the banking system have now become the primary managers of the macroeconomy in ways that their charters and their institutional cultures do not adequately prepare them for, is one of the central unresolved questions of our time. It was not a question that William Paterson asked in 1694, or that Walter Bagehot asked in 1873, or that the men on Jekyll Island asked in 1910. Each generation builds on what came before and creates problems for the generation that follows. This is perhaps the most fundamental thing that the history of central banking teaches. The history recounted in this episode is drawn from the established historical record and reflects the scholarly consensus on the major events and figures described. The founding of the Bank of England in 1694, the Mississippi Scheme and South Sea Bubble of 1720, the Panic of 1907, the Jekyll Island meeting of November 1910, the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in December 1913, the collapse of the gold standard in the 1930s, the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, and the closure of the gold window in August 1971 are all well-documented historical events. The Jekyll Island meeting was confirmed in detail by Frank Vanderlip's 1935 memoirs and has since been verified by multiple independent historical sources, including the papers of the participants. The meeting was real. The secrecy was real. The influence of the resulting draft on the Federal Reserve Act is real, though the precise degree of that influence has been a matter of scholarly debate. The attribution to Woodrow Wilson of the remark about unwittingly ruining his country is disputed. The precise phrasing does not appear in Wilson's collected papers, and some historians believe it was fabricated or significantly embellished by later critics of the Federal Reserve. What is documented is Wilson's genuine concern, expressed in letters and speeches, about concentrated financial power in America. The substance of the anxiety was his, even if the specific words may not have been. Walter Bagehot's Lombard Street, published in 1873, remains a foundational text of central banking theory and is still read by central bankers today. His dictum, lend freely, at penalty rates, against good collateral, remains the operational principle guiding central bank emergency intervention, though its application is always more complicated in practice than the principle suggests. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both created at Bretton Woods in 1944, continue to operate today. Harry Dexter White, the American architect of the Bretton Woods system, was later accused of being a Soviet spy, an allegation that remains disputed by some historians, supported by others, and unresolved in ways that add a certain additional complexity to his legacy. John Maynard Keynes died in April 1946, 2 years before the institutions he helped design came into full operation. The Federal Reserve System today consists of 12 Federal Reserve banks and a Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., whose 7 members are appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate to 14-year terms. The Federal Open Market Committee, which sets monetary policy, consists of the 7 governors plus 5 of the 12 regional bank presidents on a rotating basis, with the President of the New York Federal Reserve Bank always holding a permanent seat, a structural acknowledgement of the dominance that Benjamin Strong foresaw and which has not diminished. The Federal Reserve's dual mandate, price stability and maximum employment, was formalized by the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment Act of 1977. Prior to that legislation, the Fed's objectives were implied rather than stated. The tension between the two mandates, which sometimes pull in opposite directions as low unemployment can produce inflation, has been the central challenge of American monetary policy ever since. The Bank of England was nationalised in 1946 under the post-war Labour government, ending its status as a private company. It was granted operational independence, the right to set interest rates without government approval, in May 1997, in the first week of Tony Blair's government. The European Central Bank, established in 1998 as the monetary authority for the euro area, was designed with formal independence written into the Maastricht Treaty, making it constitutionally insulated from government pressure in ways that neither the Bank of England nor the Federal Reserve achieved without considerable historical struggle. The word credit derives from the Latin credere, to believe. The entire system described in this episode, the bills of exchange, the banknotes, the fractional reserves, the central bank backstops, the fiat currencies, the quantitative easing programs, rests ultimately on that act of belief. It is not a fragile belief. It has sustained itself through wars and depressions and panics and technological revolutions over the course of 3.5 centuries. But it is a belief, and understanding what it is grounded in and what it requires of the institutions that sustain it remains the most important unsolved problem in economics. You have travelled a long way tonight, from the wooden bench in the Florentine marketplace to the gilded halls of a desperate English court, from the paper fever of Paris to the calm authority of a Victorian journalist writing about the nature of money, from the panicked backrooms of New York to a private island where 7 men sat with their shotguns and their ledgers and designed something larger than any of them fully understood. The story of central banking is the story of money itself, which is to say, it is the story of trust, of the endlessly renewed human experiment in agreeing to believe in things that are not quite solid. A piece of paper, a number on a screen, the promise of an institution you have never visited, governed by people you have never met, operating on principles that were established in conversations you were not invited to attend. And yet the system works, imperfectly, unequally, with recurring crises and recurring reinventions. But it works, in the sense that you can walk to a shop tomorrow morning and exchange a piece of printed paper for food, and the person behind the counter will accept it without hesitation, because they too believe in the paper. The collective agreement holds. The trust sustains itself, morning after morning, transaction after transaction, across 300 years and 44 nations and uncountable individual lives. There is something worth noticing in that. Something almost beautiful, in its strange, contingent human way. The room is quiet now. The history has settled. The long arc of monetary civilization, from the goldsmith's receipt to the Federal Reserve's digital ledger, is at rest for the evening, the way old things rest when no one is asking questions of them. Let your breathing find its own rhythm. Let the thoughts that have been moving through your mind begin to slow, to soften, to lose their sharp edges. The questions that remain unanswered will still be there in the morning. They have been there for 300 years. They will keep. The night is very still. The money in your wallet is a promise. The money in your account is a number. The number rests on a system. The system rests on trust. And the trust tonight is holding. Let it hold. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.